Hey guys, welcome to Boxing Squared for boxing news and views from around the internet. The former title challenger Bryant Jennings has made some bold claims, one about Luis Ortiz, two the fight with Oscar Rivas that he had in 2019, and as part of those first two things, he's made some claims about the Turning Stone resort where those two fights were held. So we'll start off with Luis Ortiz with the tweet that he's put out, which is quite controversial in my view. He says Luis Ortiz was allegedly on Peds, bracket, I'm going to say allegedly because he got away with it, bracket, when we fought. That's why the fight was at Turning Stone, because that venue isn't strict when it comes to manipulating regulations. The most credible source possible spilled the beans. Fact! Exclamation point. So that is quite a bold claim to make. He says allegedly, but he says Luis Ortiz was on something at the time. There's a few things to unpack. I think one of the reasons he will be suspicious of Ortiz is Ortiz does have a history, and we'll come to that in a moment. But this other stuff here, when he talks about, and this is relevant for the second tweet that he's put out, about it being at Turning Stone and that it isn't strict as a venue when it comes to manipulating regulations. So what is he actually really saying there? Is he saying that are they not doing things the same as they are, say, in New York City or other sort of venues that are around the state? It seems to be that he believes that at Turning Stone you can get away with a lot more than elsewhere, and that in itself is quite a big claim. He's come out with quite a bit, but he's still left quite a bit in reserve. Obviously, a tweet can only have, 280 characters, and he's not saying everything that he thinks, and perhaps that is because, one, maybe legal reasons, two, for brevity, because he can't because of the limited space. But even saying this, saying that Ortiz got away with something, I mean, it does beg the question. One, what will Team Ortiz say in response? And I did have a look at Luis Ortiz's advisor, King Kong Boxing, to check what was if there was anything there, but there was nothing. But I'm sure if this does bubble up anymore, we will have some sort of response. But Ortiz does have a history of performance-enhancing drug use. So about a year before that Bryant Jennings fight, which was in 2015, he did fail a drugs test after a fight with Latif Kiyodi. That was actually a fight for an interim WBA title. Subsequently, he failed the test, and then obviously leading up to the 2017 fight, which would have been with Deontay Wilder, he failed the test, but that was later put down to paperwork not being filed, and that was a case where the WBC believed him, so he wasn't punished or sanctioned by that sanctioning body, but the WBA didn't, and the WBA obviously had some involvement with Ortiz from that first failed test. So there is some history there, which I'm sure Bryant Jennings is suspect of, but this other sort of element of it, basically saying that it was at that venue and they were able to get away with more stuff because it was there. But maybe we can look at this in another light for some balance here. It was a fight that Bryant Jennings lost. We can't forget that. Luis Ortiz knocked Bryant Jennings out, the former title challenger who'd gone the distance with Vladimir Klitschko a year earlier. Ortiz stopped him with a vicious uppercut, and that was a strategy in a fight that Bryant Jennings, if he could do it over, he probably wouldn't fight the same way, but he's a guy who loves a bit of a tear-up in the pocket, and it sort of went the wrong way for him, and it was lights out for him in that fight. So we just have to consider that maybe there is some sour grapes there, because where's this come from? Why now? Like 5 years on from that fight. If he really believed something was happening, why not say something at the time? And I don't actually know the state of his sort of promotional deal, if he actually still is with Top Rank, because we really haven't heard his name mentioned for any fights. His last fight was against Joe Joyce, and that was in early 2019, and it's gone pretty much quiet since then. So maybe he is off contract, I don't know, because being fed to Joe Joyce in the UK at the time, to me, seemed a little bit curious, given that Jennings still had some ambition, but ultimately he was fed to a prospect. He had to go on the road, and he lost that fight. So maybe he is off contract and maybe a bit bitter about how some things have turned out in his career. And getting on to the Rivas fight, so this is another tweet that he put up at about the same time as this other one with the Ortiz one. When I fought at Turning Stone for the second time, it was something up with Rivas test results. Don't know if it was his eye issue or if they were hiding something, but the fight had to be at Turning Stone because they were the only venue that'll let whatever the issue was slide. That fight with Oscar Rivas was at the start of 2019. Actually, so Rivas, that was in January of that year, and the Joe Joyce fight was in the middle of 2019. So apologies for the earlier date confusion. I think I said that was at the start of 2019. It was mid-29, the Joyce fight. But the Rivas one, he lost that as well. He was stopped in the final round, and it was a pretty competitive, it was a close fight. I think two judges had Rivas up, and one had it for Bryant Jennings at the time of the stoppage. So it was a close fight. Ultimately, he was stopped in that last round. Rivas sort of exploded into life. So what is he really talking about here with the Turning Stone Resort? Because he seems to be suggesting that some of the people that are involved with putting fights on there, that they're turning a blind eye to certain things. He's alleged it with the Ortiz fight. He's alleged it with this Rivas one. But actually, he kind of almost takes some credit away for himself because he talks about the eye issue for Rivas. Oscar Rivas had struggled to get cleared to fight in the United States before that fight with Bryant Jennings. He'd had a couple of fights because of an eye issue that had to be cancelled. That was earlier in his career against Gerald Washington and Amir Mansour. So he was able to pass the eye exam. But if there was an issue with Rivas's eye and it was sort of, there was a blind eye turn to it, doesn't that suggest that Oscar Rivas was doing better than he really should have, given he had some sort of issue potentially that could have potentially been holding him back from performing at his best? I don't know, it just sort of seems a bit curious with that. So what's prompted this outburst on social media from Bryant Jennings is unclear, but he is saying that the two fights that he had at Turning Stone, both losses, both by knockout, dodgy things were happening there. People were turning blind eyes to different things, and he's saying, alleging that Luis Ortiz was on performance-enhancing substances for that fight. So you have to ask the question with that, well, what sort of drug testing was in place? He should probably know that because he'd be aware of what was in the contract, what sort of testing they would have in place. But he seems to be implying that people let things slide or didn't do what they were meant to do. It's just, what he's saying. We'll have to see if anyone responds to his claims, but bold claims nonetheless, saying that there was something dodgy up with those two fights. What do you make of it all? Drop a comment, loud and often, hit like, hit subscribe, follow me on Twitter, boxing_squared. I'm out.